All right, next question is about taxation. And 3 minutes each. And the speaking order is Kelda Fran Mandela. You ready, Kelda?
Always.
Research from the Institute on Taxation and Economic Policy shows that the wealthiest 1% of Wisconsinites making more than $500,000 per year, which is more than in anyone else in the state, pay overall a lower tax rate, lower than the rest of the state, 99% of the state. What is your response to this, and how would you rebalance our tax system to ensure that the economy works for everyday families? Specifically, what is one change in tax policy that you would pursue in your first proposed budget?
How I feel about it is angry because I think it's totally unfair and unjust. And I think we have given millionaires and billionaires who have benefited the most from what society has to offer and our economy. And we have given them a free ride, and it comes at everybody else's expense. And we've done the same thing with businesses. I'm a small business owner, and small businesses pay a much greater proportion of the money that we earn in not just income tax, but in sales tax and property tax. And big businesses and corporations are often given money. They're actually handed money by the state. So the most important thing that we can do is return to Wisconsin's roots as a progressive state with progressive taxation. That means the more you make, the more you pay. And that is as it should be, right? We absolutely will all do better in a state where everyone has the opportunity to thrive, where young people feel like they can afford to have a family, start a business, buy a home in their 20s instead of their 40s. That's the kind of Wisconsin where everyone has the freedom to thrive. To do it, you have to have the revenue and the resources. And Republicans have engaged in a systematic effort over decades to starve our most important public institutions of their resources. And I'm talking about K-12 public education, public higher education, local governments that deliver all of the services that we rely on in this community. When the state doesn't pay its fair share, that means it gets transferred onto property taxpayers. And that is unjust because property taxes are not really based on your ability to pay in the same way that income taxes are. Now, I know that people don't love paying taxes, but I want to talk for a minute about the other side of it. Wages. The affordability crisis is not just a problem with how much things cost. It absolutely is that, and we have Donald Trump and Tom Tiffany to thank for it. But the other piece that needs a lot of attention is how much money goes into people's pockets. And that is why I am proud to be the lead author of the living wage bill that will bring our minimum wage up to $15 an hour immediately with a path to 20 by 2030. I will also restore collective bargaining rights in the public and private sectors because that's how you build the middle class. Listen, if we had had wages and wage growth that we had from, say, the 1930s to the 1970s, over the last 50 years, we'd all be making twice as much money. How about that? We've never had workers taking home a smaller share of the wealth that we create, and those at the very top taking home a greater share. We are more gilded than the Gilded Age. Tax policy is a part of the solution for that, but also making sure that every single working person has not just dignity in their job, but a voice in the workplace, and that they are paid fairly for the labor that they are giving. That's how you solve the problem.
Thanks, Kelda. Fran?
Earlier this past year, I introduced legislation that would increase the millionaire tax, add an additional billionaire tax, and lower property taxes by up to 40% while funding special education. This tax package also included giving our local governments taxing authority to implement either a wealth tax or a local income sales tax increase. But you know, the senator is absolutely right that we need to go back to having a progressive tax system again. Right now, the reality is 99% of the businesses in Wisconsin are small businesses, so making under $5 million in annual revenue or having fewer than 25 employees. And they pay a higher tax rate than many of our largest manufacturers and large corporations that are eligible for this tax credit called the Manufacturing and Agricultural Tax Credit. This is a credit that we have to repeal and make sure actually helps some of our smaller farmers, as opposed to giving some of these large corporations corporations a tax rate that is close to zero, and it costs the state up to $400 million a year. Now, this can be used to fund healthy school meals for all, where every child in our state, my legislation that would ensure that all kids in K-12, public, private, charter, school for visually impaired, would have access to a free breakfast and lunch. The money is there. It is how we are prioritizing it and who it serves first. In addition to raising wages, right now, $15, $20 an hour is not a living wage, and our local governments do not have the authority to increase the minimum wage to a living wage. The state preempts so much of our local governments from doing what we know local governments know our communities better than just the state. So removing those preemptions and then making sure that what this additional investment in revenue that's coming into the state and the money that the state is saving by not having our money go to pay for large tax breaks and tax credits, we will actually be able to put investments into childcare, paid leave, and comprehensive paid leave. This is already being passed in other states. Minnesota, our neighbors did it. No worker should have to choose between taking care of an aging parent and or a new baby and missing hours at work or a paycheck. These are things that are good for employers to be able to compete when you have larger corporations that are able to be eligible for tax credit, yet they're offering things to employees that are making it harder for our smaller businesses to be able to compete with. Paid leave shouldn't be seen as a benefit, but a right and something that we need to make sure that parents have time to bond with their kids, to make sure that our, as our state continues to age, that we are able to find ways for folks to be able to take care of their aging parents. So it is, comprehensive tax policy to make sure that the lowest income earners aren't paying higher tax rates than some of the wealthiest, and our small businesses aren't paying higher tax rates than some of the largest corporations.
Thanks, Fran. Mandela.
So a lot of communities all across Wisconsin, it feels like an historic number every single year or every election cycle are going to referendum just to fund the school system, just to keep the lights on, just to keep teachers in the classroom, when many of our schools need significant upgrades to equipment and technology. But our state has not fully funded our public schools as we should. And it's created a problem. And people, many communities are voting to raise their own taxes, but we're also, or raise their own property taxes, but we're also seeing a lot of those referendum questions fail. And school districts across the state are going insolvent. And I guess it's a two-part question, because of course our schools should be fully funded and that burden shouldn't fall on property taxpayers as heavily as it is. And the question is always, well, all right, well, how do you suppose we pay for it? Well, obviously we do have a bit of a surplus here in the state, but we need to have long-term sustainable funding. We can't just count on a one-time surplus to get us out of this hole, and ultimately leave people with the rug pulled from underneath them the following year or the following budget cycle. That being said, it goes back to taxing the wealthy, the corporations, the ones that send our good jobs out of the state, the companies that are looking to outsource artificial intelligence. And if you aren't paying a living wage, you don't deserve tax breaks here in Wisconsin. And as was mentioned, repealing or at a minimum reforming the agriculture manufacturing tax credit that gives the bulk of that incentive to large out-of-state corporations versus Main Streets, and gives the bulk of those incentives to more of the corporate farms and not the family farms that have done a great deal to provide a service to communities all across Wisconsin. We're talking about the people who are going to be here through the thick and the thin, through the good and the bad, not the people who just get to pick up and leave Wisconsin at their leisure. And we have to be able to hold, again, the wealthiest accountable. And I think that the agriculture manufacturing tax credit gives us the easiest way out to provide real relief for families. It is so difficult when you think about local government funding and financing, as was brought up before I had a chance to speak. Communities, cities are struggling right now. And it's tough when you have an instance where you have to raise sales taxes, because it is still a regressive tax. I mean, fully acknowledging that communities need that sales tax to keep government functions going, keeping essential services happening. But that's why we need to increase state aid, and we can increase state aid through tax and healthy versus having to use the path of, or use the last resort option of increasing sales tax, which puts an additional burden on people in a time of an affordability crisis. And we need to be able to avoid that, at least until things start to stabilize with costs.